Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today, I have a story that's more intense than most, one that's filled with unexpected twists, betrayal, and a father's fight to protect his kids. Imagine thinking you'd left your troubled past behind, only to find out there's a hidden darkness lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more stories like this. Let's dive in. The day I found out changed everything. I'd never been one to check up on my wife. We'd been together for almost 10 years, and she had always been that stable, loving person I could count on. But over the past few months, I'd noticed subtle changes. She'd started staying out late for work meetings. That dragged into the night. Her phone was suddenly glued to her hand, and our conversations felt stilted, almost rehearsed. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a phase, that maybe she was stressed with work or our two young kids. But a nagging feeling gnawed at feeling I couldn't shake. One evening, when she was supposedly out for another one of her meetings, a friend called me. He sounded uncomfortable, hesitant even as he spoke, almost like he wished he hadn't dialed my number. After a few tense moments, he finally confessed. He'd seen my wife that night, not at a meeting, but at a quiet, out-of-the-way restaurant with another man. They weren't just talking, they looked intimate. I hung up the phone, a cold anger washing over me. That night, I put the kids to bed and stayed up, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. The next few days were a blur of planning and heartache. I needed proof, something undeniable. Hiring a private investigator seemed extreme, but I was desperate. The investigator was thorough, and within a week, he handed me photos, texts, and details that shattered any lingering doubt. There she was, the woman I'd built a life with, entangled with this man. A stranger who, I found out, was nothing more than a shallow, self-centered businessman with a questionable reputation. But I wasn't going to let my life fall apart without a fight. I didn't want a messy confrontation. I wanted control. And so, I decided to confront them on my terms. I waited for a night when I knew they'd be together. I arrived at the hotel, every nerve in my body steeled, every step carefully measured. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When it opened, they both froze, her lover's face drained of color, and my wife's eyes widened with panic. She stammered something, trying to explain, but I held up my hand. I was too calm, I think, because the silence in the room felt thick, tense, like something heavy that could collapse at any moment. I know everything, I said, my voice steady. And you, I directed at her lover, need to understand what you've walked into. Without giving either of them a chance to respond, I left. I didn't yell or make a scene. I didn't need to. They knew now that I was aware, and that, in some twisted way, seemed to rattle them more than any outburst could have. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I went to stay with a close friend. Someone who'd been through a similar experience and could offer some perspective. As the days went by, I began plotting my next moves. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this betrayal and walk out of our marriage with everything we'd built. No, if anything, I was going to make sure that I came out of this with my dignity intact and my children. I focused on gathering evidence, documenting everything. My lawyer, a sharp, strategic woman, helped me put together a plan that would ensure I'd get full custody of our kids. My wife's affair wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was a distraction from the children, a recklessness that put her own desires above their stability and well-being. And we both knew the courts wouldn't take kindly to that. Then, there was her lover. He wasn't just going to walk away unscathed. With some digging, I found out about a few questionable business deals he'd been involved in, shady practices that, if exposed, could ruin him. I carefully compiled the information, and one evening I paid him a visit. His face was a mixture of anger and fear as he realized that I had him backed into a corner. "Stay away from my family," I told him, "and I'll keep your secrets. But if I see you near my wife or kids again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. After that, things happened quickly. The divorce proceedings were swift, efficient. The courts saw the evidence, heard the testimonies, and within months, I was granted full custody. My ex-wife was shattered, left with the remnants of the life she'd so carelessly destroyed, while her lover had disappeared without a trace, no doubt nursing his own wounds from our encounter. I moved on, pouring my energy into my children and building a new life, one that was stable and strong. But every now and then, I'd get a message from her, a desperate attempt to reconnect, a request for forgiveness. I never replied. I had built something stronger without her, and she was left with only memories of what she'd lost. The life we'd once shared felt like a distant echo, something lost in time, and yet, I knew deep down that this wasn't the end. For her, it was a haunting reminder, a shadow that would follow her wherever she went. For me, it was a beginning, and as I closed that chapter, I knew I was prepared for whatever was next, with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. But there was still a part of me that wondered if she ever let go, if someday she'd try to claw her way back into our lives, and if she did, well, I was ready. Months had passed, and life had finally settled to that felt at worst peace. The kids were adjusting well to the new routine, and although I still felt a pang whenever I thought of the way things had ended, I had come to accept it. I told myself she was gone, that she was out of my life, and that the past would remain in the past. But life has a funny way of dredging up what you thought was buried, especially when you least expect it. One evening, I was at the park with the kids. It was one of those perfect autumn days, the leaves bright with color, the air crisp. We'd spent hours running around, playing hide and seek among the trees. I watched them laugh, their faces full of joy, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as we made our way to the car, I felt a presence. Somion was watching us. I scanned the area and saw her, standing just far enough away that I'd almost missed her. My ex-wife. She looked different, almost worn, as if the months hadn't been as kind to her as they had been to me. Her eyes were fixed on the kids, and the longing in her gaze was unmistakable. I could tell she was trying to stay out of sight, but our eyes met, and there was no escaping it. I walked over, keeping the kids by my side. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and full of something I didn't want to read into. "Please," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to see them, just for a moment." A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to ignore her, to let her stand there in the cold with nothing but the remnants of her choices. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the years we'd spent together, paused. Against my better judgment, I told her, "You can talk to them for a few minutes. But only here, only now." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and approached them. The kids were hesitant at first, unsure, but she knelt down, speaking softly, her words too quiet for me to hear. After a few moments, they warmed up, laughing at something she said, the way they used to when everything was normal. I felt a strange pang, anger, sadness, and maybe even a small sliver of guilt. As the minutes stretched on, I cleared my throat, signaling that it was time to go. She looked up, an unspoken plea in her eyes. I shook my head, firm but silent. We left her standing there, watching us drive away. That night, after I'd put the kids to bed, I sat in the silence of my living room, thoughts swirling. I told myself that it was nothing, that she was just a lonely woman who'd made a mistake. But something didn't sit right. Her sudden appearance, her desperation, it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I'd catch glimpses of her around town, at the grocery store, the park, even outside the kids. To Google once. She never approached, never made a scene, but the fact that she was there was enough to unsettle me. I wondered if she was trying to find a way back into our lives, or if this was just her way of coping with the loss. But it didn't end there. One night, I came home to find a small envelope wedged in the doorframe. There was no address, no signature, just my name scrawled hastily on the front. Inside, a single note in her handwriting: "You don't understand everything. There's more to this than you know. There's more to this than you know." What could she mean by that? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it fade like a bad dream. But another part, the part that had been blindsided once before, couldn't let it go. A few nights later, as I was heading to bed, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered, already knowing who it would be. Her voice came through the line, soft, hesitant. "Thank you for picking up," she said. "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." I stayed silent, waiting. She took a deep breath, and then, finally, she began. "There was more to it than just him," she said, her voice trembling. "I know you think I was just selfish, that I only cared about myself, but he wasn't who you thought he was. There were things about his life that you never knew, things I didn't know until it was too late." She paused, the silence thick with tension. "I got mixed up with him because he offered me a way out of a trap I didn't even realize I was in until it was too late. But by then, I was in too deep, and he started making threats. He threatened me, and he threatened you. The kids. It's why I left. I couldn't risk him hurting you." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a chill creep over me. It sounded like some twisted excuse, a feeble attempt at an apology, but there was something in her voice, a rawness I hadn't heard before. "I didn't just betray you," she continued. "I was trying to protect you, and now he is back, and he knows you have everything he wanted." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone, my mind reeling. I didn't want to believe her, didn't want to fall into whatever web she was spinning, but a nagging feeling told me this was far from over. I spent that night wrestling with her words, wondering what kind of danger she'd brought into our lives, what kind of man I was now unknowingly entangled with. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how dark the path might be. If this lover of hers was still lurking in the shadows, if he had any designs on my family, he'd learn soon enough that I wasn't a man to be crossed. In the weeks that followed, I started digging, reaching out to people who might know something about this man, his business, his life. What I found was darker than I'd expected: a series of shady deals, connections to dangerous people, and rumors of crimes no one would discuss openly. I began noticing strange things: a car idling a little too long near our house, an unfamiliar face in the crowd at the kids' school events. And then, one night, as I was walking to my car, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man I'd only seen in the photos the investigator had given me months ago. He was here in the flesh, and the look in his eyes told me that he wasn't here for reconciliation. He was here to settle something. I straightened up, meeting his gaze, my mind racing with possibilities. I had no intention of letting him intimidate me, no matter what history he shared with my ex-wife. He took a step forward, his voice low and taunting. "You took what's mine," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "And I don't forget things like that." I clenched my fists, the weight of everything settling in. I knew in that moment that this wasn't just about revenge or betrayal, it was about survival. I had one choice: protect my family at any cost. As I walked away, I knew one thing was certain: his wasn't over. I knew this wouldn't be the last time I'd see him. The look in his eyes made it clear he was a man who didn't give up. And if everything my ex-wife had said was true, he was dangerous, more dangerous than I could have imagined. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every detail of our encounter, trying to piece together a plan. I'd spent months thinking I was free from her betrayal, free from the life I'd left behind. But now I felt like a pawn in a larger game, one I hadn't even known I was playing. If he was here to make good on his threats, he wouldn't stop at just intimidating me. He'd come after my kids, my family, everything I'd fought to protect. The next morning, I decided to take action. My first call was to the private investigator who had helped me uncover her affair months ago. I explained the situation, leaving out none of the details. He listened in silence, and when I finished, there was a long pause. "I can dig deeper," he said finally, "but this sounds bigger than either of us thought. This guy's name's connected to some powerful people. This could be risky." "I don't care about the risk," I replied, my voice steady. "I need to know everything, and I need to know how to keep my family safe." Over the next week, the investigator worked tirelessly, feeding me updates as he uncovered details about this man's past. His name, Victor Hale, was notorious in certain circles. He was involved in everything from black market deals to arms smuggling, his connections spanning cities and countries. He built his reputation on fear and violence, leaving behind a trail of people too scared to speak out. It was a network of crime, corruption, and hidden power that I couldn't have imagined. But the deeper we dug, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Hale had been watching us for longer than I'd realized. My investigator found traces of surveillance, signs that someone had been monitoring my house, my routine, even my kids' school schedule. I felt like a fly trapped in a spider's web, with every move I made pulling me deeper into his sights. One night, as I sat in my office, poring over documents and security footage the investigator had managed to obtain, I heard a noise outside, a soft, scraping sound, barely audible. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. But as I turned back toward the room, I froze. My phone, which I'd left on the table, was vibrating with a call. I didn't recognize the number, but a feeling of dread washed over me as I answered. A voice, smooth, menacing, drifted through the line. "I see you've been digging around in places you shouldn't. You think you're clever, don't you?" It was him. "Hell, you're making a mistake," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "If you come after my family, you'll regret it." A low chuckle echoed through the phone. "Oh, I think it's you who'll regret it. You don't know who you're dealing with." His voice turned icy. "This could have been easy, you know. But now you've made it personal." The line went dead, leaving me standing in the silence, the chill of his words settling into my bones. I knew now that he wasn't just toying with me, was planning something that wouldn't end until he got what he wanted. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't over my head. I needed help. The next morning, I drove across town to meet with an old friend, Jack, a former Marine who had a reputation for handling problems that couldn't be solved through ordinary means. We hadn't talked much since my divorce, but he'd always been there when I needed him. After a long conversation, explaining every detail I could remember, he nodded slowly. "This guy sounds like trouble," he said, "but if he's watching you, then he's watching everyone around you. That means he has a weakness, thinks he's in control. We can use that." Jack agreed to help, but he warned me. Going up against a man like Hale meant we had to be prepared for anything. He spent the next few days setting up a network of security measures around my home: cameras, alarms, even a safe room for the kids. He taught me techniques to detect if I was being followed, strategies to keep a low profile. I felt a small sense of relief, but it wasn't enough to erase the gnawing fear that had taken root. One evening, as we finished setting up the last camera outside the house, Jack looked at me, his expression grim. "There's one more thing we need to do," he said. "If he's coming for you, he'll try to get to you through people you care about. That means we need to talk to her, your ex-wife. She knows more than she's letting on." The thought of facing her again, of hearing more excuses or lies, made me sick. But I knew Jack was right. If she had information that could help us, we needed it. Reluctantly, I arranged a meeting at a diner on the edge of town, a place that was quiet, out of the way. Jack would be nearby, watching from a distance. When she arrived, she looked tired, her face drawn and anxious. She sat across from me, clutching her coffee cup, her hands shaking. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I got straight to the point. "Tell me everything you know about him, about why he's here and why he's after my family." She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. Finally, she took a deep breath and began. "Victor Hale is? He's more than just a lover I left you for," she confessed, her voice cracking. "He's a man I got tangled up with because I thought he could give me something I was missing. Something? Exciting. But I was wrong. He wasn't interested in me, was interested in controlling me, in making me one of his puppets." She paused, her eyes haunted. "When I tried to leave him, he made it clear that I couldn't just walk away. He used threats, blackmail, anything to keep me under his thumb. He had information on me, things that could ruin me. And when I lost custody of the kids, he was furious. He thought I'd be able to keep them, that I could, that he could use them as leverage." I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my composure. "Leverage for what?" "For everything. Control over you, over our family, over everything I have left," she whispered. "He doesn't care about you or the kids, just wants power. And he knows that hurting you is the quickest way to get it." Jack's words echoed in my mind. He thinks he can control Dop, but maybe, just maybe, that arrogance would be his downfall. Over the next few days, we began planning a trap. Jack and I worked tirelessly, mapping out every detail, every possible outcome. We set up decoys, created false leads, anything to lure Hale out and expose him for the man he truly was. We knew it was risky, that there was a chance everything could go wrong, but I had no choice to do anything to protect my kids, to end this nightmare once and for all. The night of our plan came, and we waited in tense silence, watching the monitors, waiting for any sign of Hale. Jack and I watched, every muscle tense as Hale approached, his face twisted in a look of cruel determination. He had no idea he was walking into a trap, no idea we were waiting, watching. When he finally reached the front door, Jack moved, swift and silent. Within seconds, Hale was mobilized, his face contorted with rage and shock as he realized he'd been outsmarted. But as we held him there, he managed a dark, twisted smile. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won? I have connections, people who will come after you, after your children. This is just the beginning." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I knew we'd taken the first step in ending this, but his threat lingered, a reminder that we weren't safe just yet. As the authorities took him away, I realized there was a new shadow over our lives, a shadow that would only lift if I could find a way to eliminate his influence, once and for all. And so, as I watched him disappear into the back of a police car, I knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun.